The glass-walled office of Knight Enterprises stood tall, an empire built by the ruthless yet brilliant Alexander Knight. To the world, he was untouchable, sharp-witted, unyielding, and dangerously powerful. But to Elena Brooks, his secretary, he was just a man who barely ate, hardly slept, and worked himself into exhaustion every single day. That morning, as Elena entered his office, she found Alexander hunched over his desk, his fingers pressing against his temples. His usual confidence seemed shaken, his breath shallow. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, concerned. "I don't have time to be sick," he muttered, waving her off. But before he could sign the document in front of him, his hand trembled, and in the blink of an eye, he collapsed. "Sir!" Elena rushed to his side, panic gripping her chest. His skin was ice-cold, his breathing ragged. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and called an ambulance. As paramedics carried him away, she climbed into the ambulance with him, holding his hand despite knowing he'd never approve if he were conscious. But she didn't care. No one should go through this alone. Later at the hospital, the beeping monitors filled the sterile hospital room as Dr. Olivia Hayes examined Alexander. "Extreme exhaustion, dehydration, and dangerously high stress levels," she informed Elena. "He needs rest, but knowing his nature, he'll fight against it. He needs someone to keep an eye on him." Elena swallowed. She should go home. Her job didn't require her to be here. But when she looked at Alexander lying unconscious, his usual intimidating presence replaced with vulnerability, something in her heart clenched. She sat down beside his bed. "I'll stay," she whispered. Little did she know the journey ahead would change everything. Hours passed. The rhythmic beeping of the machines filled the hospital room, and Elena sat by Alexander's bedside, watching his pale face. She had worked for him for 3 years, long enough to know he had no family nearby, no friends who would sit by his side. The great Alexander Knight ruled the corporate world, but in moments like these, he was just alone. A nurse entered, checking his vitals. "You don't have to stay, miss. Patients like him wake up and go right back to work." Elena glanced at Alexander's sleeping form. "Then I'll make sure he doesn't." She adjusted the blanket over him, ignoring the way her fingers brushed against his. A few hours later, a sharp inhale broke the silence. Elena's eyes snapped up as Alexander stirred, his brows furrowing. His head turned slightly, his dark eyes fluttering open, adjusting to the light. For the first time since she met him, he looked confused. "Where?" His voice was raspy, barely above a whisper. Elena leaned closer. "You collapsed in your office. We're at the hospital. Don't try to get up." His gaze locked onto hers, something flickering in his eyes. Surprise? Annoyance? He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through him, making him groan. "Damn it!" he muttered, rubbing his forehead. Then, his attention returned to Elena. "Why are you here?" Elena crossed her arms. "Because you clearly don't know how to take care of yourself." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't need anyone to." "Save it, Mr. Knight," she interrupted, her voice firm but soft. "The doctor said you need rest. And whether you like it or not, I'm staying to make sure you actually do." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Alexander's sharp gaze studied her as if trying to figure out her intentions. Then, to her surprise, he sighed and leaned back against the pillow. "You're too stubborn, Brooks." Elena smirked. "Someone has to be." But deep down she wondered, why did he let her stay? She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment their fates began to intertwine. The next morning, Elena woke up to the sound of soft murmurs. Blinking away the sleep, she found Dr. Olivia Hayes checking Alexander's vitals while he scowled at the 4 in his arm. "You're still here." Alexander's deep voice pulled Elena's attention. She stretched her arms, ignoring the stiffness in her back. "Of course. Someone had to make sure you didn't escape in the middle of the night." Dr. Hayes chuckled. "Good luck with that, Miss Brooks. He's already asked me to discharge him twice. Elena shot Alexander a glare. Are you serious? You almost worked yourself to death, and you're already thinking about leaving. Alexander looked away, but his jaw clenched. I have responsibilities. Elena sighed, frustration bubbling inside her. And who will handle them if you end up in a worse condition? You need to stop thinking of yourself as invincible. Alexander's fingers twitched against the blanket. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by an employee. Yet something about Elena's concern felt different. Fine, he muttered. A few more hours. But after that I'm going home. Dr. Hayes raised a brow. We'll see about that. Later that evening, Elena stepped out to grab a cup of coffee when she noticed something odd. A man in a dark suit stood near the hospital entrance, watching Alexander's room. His posture was stiff, his eyes calculating. The moment Elena spotted him, he turned away and disappeared into the hallway. Her heart pounded. Was she imagining things? Shaking off the unease, she hurried back to Alexander's room. But as she sat down beside him, her mind lingered on that mysterious figure. Something told her Alexander's collapse wasn't just exhaustion, and whoever that man was, he was watching. Elena sat beside Alexander, stirring the untouched cup of coffee in her hands. Her mind kept replaying the image of the mysterious man near the hospital entrance. Who was he? And why was he watching Alexander? She glanced at her boss. His usual cold demeanor was back, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on his phone, probably planning his escape from the hospital. You should rest instead of plotting your great escape, she muttered. Alexander's gaze flickered to her. I don't like hospitals. Lena smirked. Really? I thought you just didn't like listening to people. A corner of his lips twitched as if he wanted to smirk but held back. Instead he put his phone aside. You stayed all night. He shrugged. It's not a big deal. It is, he said quietly. For a moment the air between them shifted. The usual tension of boss and employee melted, replaced with something softer, something neither of them could name. But before Elena could respond, a knock interrupted them. Ryan Carter, Alexander's best friend and business partner, stepped inside. His usual easygoing smile faltered when he saw Alexander hooked up to machines. Damn, man. You look terrible. Alexander rolled his eyes. Nice to see you too, Ryan. Ryan turned to Elena. And you must be the reason he's still here. Thank you for keeping this idiot from making a run for it. Elena chuckled. I did what I could. But then Ryan's expression darkened. He lowered his voice. We need to talk. Alone. Elena frowned. If it's about work, it can wait. He needs to recover. Ryan hesitated before nodding. You're right. But just so you know, something isn't right. He gave Alexander a look, one filled with unspoken words. Elena didn't miss the way Alexander's posture stiffened. Something was wrong, and she was determined to find out what. Elena sat by the window, pretending to read a magazine, but her focus remained on Alexander and Ryan. They thought she wasn't paying attention. They were wrong. Ryan leaned in, his voice low but urgent. It wasn't just exhaustion, Alex. The doctors found traces of a sedative in your system. Elena's heart skipped a beat. Sedative. Alexander's expression darkened. You're saying someone drugged me? Ryan nodded. And I don't think it was an accident. Elena couldn't stay silent. But why would someone do that? Both men turned to her. She had forgotten they didn't know she was listening. Alexander's gaze locked onto hers, unreadable. That's what I intend to find out. She stepped closer. You think someone in the company did this? Alexander exhaled sharply. I have enemies, Elena. Some in business. Some elsewhere. Ryan added. You collapsed at the office. Whoever did this wanted you weak, vulnerable. Elena's mind raced. The strange man watching the hospital. the unease she felt. It wasn't paranoia. Someone was after Alexander, and he had no idea how much danger he was in. Later that night, Alexander had fallen asleep, a rare sight. Elena adjusted his blanket, watching the lines of tension on his face soften. He looked so different like this. Not the ruthless billionaire, but a man who carried too much weight on his shoulders. She sighed, whispering, "Who's trying to hurt you, Alexander?" A soft knock at the door startled her. She turned, expecting a nurse. But instead, a folded note lay on the floor. Frowning, she picked it up and unfolded the crisp paper. "Stay out of this, Miss Brooks. This is not your fight." Her hands trembled. Someone knew she was involved, and they were watching. Elena's pulse pounded as she stared at the note in her trembling hands. The ink was bold, the message chilling. "Stay out of this, Miss Brooks. This is not your fight." She turned sharply, scanning the empty hallway. Who had left it? How did they know she was involved? Swallowing hard, she folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. She couldn't tell Alexander. Not yet. He was already dealing with too much. The last thing he needed was another reason to worry. But one thing was certain. Someone didn't want her here. And that only made her more determined to stay. The next morning, Alexander stirred awake, his sharp eyes finding Elena already at his bedside. "You stayed again." His voice was hoarse, but the surprise was evident. Elena offered a small smile. "You sound shocked every time. Should I stop?" His gaze softened for just a second before he masked it with indifference. "Do whatever you want." Ryan entered, tossing a file onto the bedside table. "Good news. I pulled some security footage from the office before you collapsed." Alexander sat up, frowning. "And?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "Someone entered your office before you got sick. A man in a gray suit. He was inside for 2 minutes, and then you walked in." Elena's stomach twisted. "Did you recognize him?" Ryan shook his head. "No. But I sent the footage to security to track him down." Alexander clenched his fists. "Whoever did this had access to my office. This isn't just business rivalry. This is personal." Elena hesitated. Should she tell them about the note? But before she could decide, Alexander looked at her. His tone unexpectedly gentle. "You don't have to be involved in this, Elena." Her heart skipped. "I already am." Their eyes met, longer than necessary. An understanding passed between them. She wasn't just his secretary anymore. She was someone he trusted. And that scared her more than the threat itself. Elena sat in the hospital room, her fingers tightening around the note in her pocket. Should she tell Alexander? Her instinct said yes, but something held her back. If someone was threatening her, it meant they feared her involvement. She wasn't just an employee caught in the crossfire. She was a threat to whoever was behind this. Alexander noticed her silence. "You're distracted." Elena forced a small smile. "Just tired." He studied her, his sharp gaze unreadable. "You don't have to stay here every second." She raised a brow. "And let you check out early and throw yourself back into work." "Not happening." For a second, his lips almost twitched into a smirk. Almost. But before he could respond, the door creaked open. Dr. Olivia Hayes entered, a frown on her face. "Mr. Knight, I need to speak with you about something private." Alexander motioned toward Elena. "She stays." Dr. Hayes hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. We ran additional tests, and I found something concerning." Elena's stomach knotted. "What is it?" Alexander asked, his voice calm but firm. Dr. Hayes set a report on the table. "The sedative in your system, it wasn't an ordinary sleeping agent. It was something stronger, meant to disorient and weaken you over time." Elena's breath caught. "You mean someone was slowly trying to break him down?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "Yes. And if Miss Brooks hadn't gotten you to the hospital in time, Mr. Knight, your condition could have worsened dramatically." A heavy silence filled the room. Alexander's jaw clenched, his fists tightening. Someone wants me out of the way. Elena placed a hand on the table to steady herself. This wasn't just an attack. It was calculated. Alexander exhaled sharply, then turned to her. You saved my life. She swallowed hard. I just did what anyone would do. His gaze softened, but only for a second. No, Elena. Not anyone. You. Her heart pounded. She had been by his side for years, but for the first time she felt truly seen by him. And that terrified her more than anything. Elena barely heard the doctor leave. Her mind replayed Alexander's words. You saved my life. She had always known him as the ruthless, untouchable billionaire. But now, seeing him vulnerable, realizing he had nearly died, something inside her shifted. Someone had tried to destroy him. And if they weren't caught, they might try again. Alexander leaned back against the pillows, deep in thought. Whoever did this had access to my office, my schedule, and enough knowledge to use a slow-acting sedative. Elena crossed her arms. That means it's someone close to you. His gaze darkened. That narrows it down to about 20 people. Elena sighed. And here I thought billionaires only had a handful of enemies. For the first time in days, Alexander actually smirked. I'm special. She rolled her eyes, but her smile faded when she remembered the note in her pocket. Someone knew she was getting too close. Before she could decide whether to tell him, Ryan walked in. His expression unreadable. We found him. Alexander straightened. The man from the security footage. Ryan nodded. His name is David Cross. Mid-level executive at Knight Enterprises. He's been on leave for the past 2 weeks, but he was in the office the day you collapsed. Elena's stomach churned. Did you talk to him? Ryan exhaled. No, he's missing. His apartment is empty, and no one has seen him since that day. Silence filled the room. Alexander's voice was cold. Find him. Ryan nodded and left, leaving Elena alone with Alexander once again. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. Someone tried to kill me, and now the only lead we have is gone. Elena hesitated, then reached for his hand without thinking. We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this, Alexander. He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over, letting her fingers rest against his palm. For the first time, he didn't push her away. And that was more dangerous than any enemy they were chasing. Elena felt the warmth of Alexander's hand beneath hers, but before she could react, he gently pulled away. His face returned to its usual unreadable mask, but something had changed. He trusted her now. But trust wasn't enough to keep him safe. Alexander exhaled sharply. I need to get out of this hospital. Elena shot him a warning look. You heard the doctor, you're not ready to leave. He met her gaze, unwavering. I won't recover here. I need to be in my own space, surrounded by my own security. Whoever did this to me isn't finished. She hesitated. He had a point. But the idea of him being out in the open, vulnerable again, made her uneasy. Before she could argue, Ryan re-entered the room, his expression grim. We have a problem. Alexander stiffened. What now? Ryan handed him a tablet. An hour ago, someone tried to access your penthouse. Security cameras caught a masked man bypassing the lower floor systems. If the guards hadn't been on alert, he might have made it inside. Elena's breath caught. You think it's the same person who drugged you? Ryan nodded. They were looking for something, Alex. Maybe for you. Alexander's face darkened. That settles it. I'm leaving this hospital today. Elena knew arguing was useless. Alexander wasn't just stubborn. He was a man who never let fear control him. But fear wasn't the problem here. Whoever was after him was growing bolder. And if they weren't careful, next time, Alexander might not survive. Later that night, By evening, Alexander was discharged under strict medical supervision. Elena rode in the back seat of his black armored SUV, her eyes flicking to every passing car. Something felt off. As they neared Alexander's penthouse, a shiver ran down her spine. She didn't know why, but she suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching them. Then, just as the car turned onto the private road leading to his residence, a pair of headlights flashed behind them. The driver tensed. "Sir, we have a tail." Lena's pulse spiked. "What do we do?" Alexander's voice was eerily calm. "We don't lead them home." Ryan grabbed his phone. "I'll call security." Crash. The vehicle behind them suddenly rammed into their car, sending them jerking forward. Elena gasped, gripping the seat as the driver struggled for control. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Lose them." The SUV swerved onto a side street, tires screeching as the unknown pursuer followed close behind. Elena's breath came fast. This wasn't just a warning. Whoever was behind this wanted Alexander dead. Elena's heartbeat thundered in her ears as the black SUV veered through the dimly lit streets of the city. The car behind them was relentless, its headlights glaring through the tinted windows like the eyes of a predator. Ryan's voice was sharp. "We have 2 more streets before we reach the private security gates." Alexander remained disturbingly calm. "We might not make it there if this continues." The vehicle behind them accelerated, preparing to ram them again. Elena clenched the seat, panic creeping into her chest. "What do they want?" Alexander's voice was cold. "To finish what they started." The driver swerved into a side alley, tires screeching as he barely avoided another impact. But the pursuer was skilled. They matched every move, staying dangerously close. Then, out of nowhere, a second car appeared, cutting off their attacker. Elena gasped as their SUV sped past, leaving the chaos behind. Ryan exhaled. What the hell just happened? Alexander's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then smirked. "That was my backup." Lena blinked. "You planned for this." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I knew whoever was after me wouldn't stop. I made sure they wouldn't get a second chance." Her stomach twisted. He was always prepared for betrayal, for attacks. But how long had he lived like this? The SUV finally reached the. Elena barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of headlights, the crash, the fear in Alexander's usually controlled expression. She wasn't just caught in the middle of his war. She was now part of it. By morning, she found Alexander in his office, already dressed in a crisp black suit, scanning through security reports. Ryan stood beside him, his expression serious. "We traced the second car, the one that saved us. It was one of your men, Alex. They found the original attacker's vehicle abandoned near the docks." Elena frowned. "And the driver?" Ryan's jaw clenched. "Gone." "It was planned." Alexander exhaled sharply, gripping the desk. "Of course it was." Elena hesitated, then finally spoke the words she had been holding back since last night. "Someone left me a note at the hospital." Both men turned to her, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. "What?" Alexander's voice was low, dangerous. She pulled the crumpled note from her pocket and handed it to him. "It said to stay out of this, that it's not my fight." Alexander's eyes darkened as he read the message. His hands tightened around the paper. Then, to her shock, he tore it in half. "This is your fight now." His voice was firm, final, ***, because I won't let anything happen to you. Elena's breath caught. "Alexander." Before she could finish, he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You should have told me sooner. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" She swallowed hard. "I didn't want to distract you." His eyes burned into hers. "You're not a distraction, Elena." Something shifted between them. A moment unspoken. Then Ryan cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "We need to focus." Whoever is behind this is getting desperate. Alexander exhaled, nodding. Find David Cross. He's the missing piece. Ryan left, but Alexander stayed close to Elena. His voice softened. I mean it, Elena. Stay close to me. I can't risk losing you. Her heart pounded. She wasn't sure if she was in more danger from his enemies, or from falling in love with him. Elena had never felt so exposed. Someone wanted her gone. Someone wanted Alexander dead. And now, standing beside him in his penthouse, she realized one thing. She was no longer afraid. She was ready to fight for him. The final lead. Ryan burst into the office, his face grim. We found David Cross. Alexander tensed. Where? Ryan exhaled. Dead. Found near the docks. Someone silenced him before we could get to him. Elena felt a shiver run down her spine. The only lead they had was gone. Alexander slammed his fist on the desk. Damn it! His jaw clenched, frustration evident. Someone is always one step ahead. Ryan hesitated. Not anymore. Before he was killed, Cross made a call to someone inside the company. Alexander's eyes darkened. Who? Ryan pulled out his phone and played the recording. A familiar voice crackled through the speakers. Did you take care of him? Elena's stomach dropped. She knew that voice. Alexander's face turned ice cold. Lucas. His own cousin. The betrayal cut deeper than any enemy ever could. The final confrontation. That night Alexander set the trap. He invited Lucas to his penthouse, pretending nothing was wrong. Elena stood by his side, her heart racing as Lucas walked in. His usual charming smile in place. Cousin, you look well. Lucas chuckled, pouring himself a drink. I was so worried about you. Alexander's expression didn't change. Were you? Lucas raised a brow. Of course. You're the heart of this company, Alexander. If something happened to you, he sighed dramatically, we'd all suffer. Elena clenched her fists. Liar. Alexander leaned forward. Tell me, Lucas. How long have you been planning my downfall? For a second Lucas froze. Then he smirked. So, you figured it out. Elena's breath caught. He wasn't even denying it. Lucas sighed, swirling his drink. I was patient, waiting, watching. But you just wouldn't step down. Always in control, always untouchable. His eyes flicked to Elena. Until her blood ran cold. What? Lucas chuckled. You never cared about anyone before. But her. The way you look at her, he smirked. She made you weak. Alexander moved so fast that Lucas barely had time to react. In one swift motion, he grabbed his cousin by the collar and slammed him against the wall. You tried to kill me. His voice was low, dangerous. You threatened Elena. Lucas scoffed. And yet, you still won, didn't you? Ryan stepped forward, phone in hand. Security has everything recorded, Lucas. It's over. For the first time, panic flickered in Lucas's eyes. You! Alexander let go of him, stepping back. I was willing to share my empire with you, Lucas. But now, you'll rot in prison before you ever touch a cent of it. Within seconds, security stormed in, dragging Lucas away. And just like that, it was over. A love that survived it all. The night was silent. Elena stood by the window, staring at the city lights. Everything was finally safe. She turned when she felt Alexander's presence behind her. It's over, she whispered. He didn't respond immediately. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he said, You were my only light through all of this. Her breath hitched. Alexander. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. You stayed. When everyone else betrayed me, you stayed. She swallowed hard. Because I. Before she could finish, he cupped her face and kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was a promise. When they pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Elena. She smiled, her heart full. I love you too. For the first time, Alexander Knight wasn't just the ruthless billionaire. He was a man in love. And for Elena, he was simply hers.